when I woke up, very confused. She said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an IRONCLAD original. Hey everybody, welcome to On the X. I'm Chris Irwin, and today my guest is Dr. Paul Conti. Dr. Conti is a distinguished psychiatrist with a PhD from Stanford University School of Medicine, and he's the former chief resident at Harvard Medical School. He's a leading expert in mental health, particularly in understanding the root causes of anxiety and stress, as well as creativity, leadership, and discipline. He's also the author of the best-selling book, Trauma, The Invisible Epidemic, which delves into how trauma works and how we can heal from it. His innovative approach to psychiatry has made him a sought-after consultant for major corporations, and he's a familiar face in the media. During our conversation, we discussed the paradigm of mental health versus physical health, persistent trauma, emotional reaction and response, concepts of agency and gratitude, and other topics. I did my best to compress what could have been hours of discussion into a little over an hour, and I hope you enjoy it. So here we go with Dr. Paul Conti on the X. So I kind of want to start with, you have a book about trauma, which I want to delve into a bunch, but just sort of starting more broadly than that, when I think of, and this is a topic that's kind of near and dear to me too, and just in mental health in general.
Yes.
What is it that we, given the fact that so many of the trends in mental health are going, I would say, in the wrong direction, increases in anxiety and depression and suicide, all of those things, why is that? What are we doing wrong from sort of a paradigm perspective? Like how we think about mental health? Is there a way we're approaching it that's just incorrect, that's leading to that?
Mm-hmm. I do. I think that we're approaching it entirely incorrectly. And then on top of that, there have been very difficult world events in the last several years from the pandemic on forward. So we've added an increase in stressors and in fear-generating information that is circulating around, our societies and our minds, and it's all in the context of a framing of mental health that is, I think, neither accurate nor helpful.
And so dig into that more. In what way? Because when I look at it, I sort of try to compare mental health to physical health. And I think physical health is something that we pretty much understand how to do it. I think we're sort of like, okay, it's diet, exercise, and recovery for the most part. If you eat well and you get enough exercise and you get enough sleep, kind of gets you to probably 90% of the solution. And there's some other things you could throw in there, but it's a very empowering message too, where it's basically on you. Sometimes we get away from that these days, but I think by and large throughout history, it's been, hey, you are in charge of your physical health. Yeah. I think a lot of times with mental health, we end up with this sort of pathology, and Absolutely. We treat it like sort of the illness aspect, like some disease you caught or something, which to me is a very disempowering message. It's very much like, do you have mental health problems or not? And if you don't, then you're fine. But if you do, then you need to seek treatment in some form or fashion, whether that's pharmaceuticals or therapy or something like that. Is that accurate? And should we be thinking of it more like physical health, where it's like, look, you're in charge of a lot of this. Not to say you shouldn't get help for certain things, but it can be a lot more empowering for people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the framing around our mental health should be the same as the framing around our physical health, right? Because you're right. So diet, exercise, like things that are so clear, but the devil's in the details, right? I mean, consistently having a healthy diet, consistently exercising, figuring out what's best for me in terms of diet and exercise, what are similarities to other people, what are differences, how do I understand the general principles and my own self so that I can go through this difficult process, right, to take care of my health. We don't frame mental health that way, and I think that is a huge problem. The mental health system in this country and around the world, it uses a giant book that is just an inventory of symptoms, right? And it looks to check boxes. It doesn't think like, well, what's actually going on? Where did that come from? What might be the natural course of that? What might we do about that? If we're looking at what's really going on in someone, what has happened, where it's coming from, not just taking an inventory of symptoms, then what you end up with is an inventory of symptoms, right? Which doesn't tell you what to do. And it also doesn't tell you how to take care of yourself. It's so interested in pathology, but now there's a 1,000-page book that can give us all a bunch of diagnoses instead of saying, hey, what's at the core of our mental health? What does it mean to have a stable sense of self? Right? What does it mean to be engaged in life in a way that's consistent with honoring drives within us? What are we seeking by doing that? These are very basic questions that are questions that lead to a framing of health. Like diet, what are you eating, right? How are you taking care of your body and how are you moving? Right? They're general principles, but then they lead to curiosity and to questions about the person taking care of themselves. And we don't have that for mental health. We have an inventory of symptoms. It doesn't tell you how to understand yourself and how to shepherd your own self forward.
Yeah. Are any of those diagnoses helpful in any way for anybody? Like, does it make sense to diagnose people with these things, or is that completely counterproductive to what we should be doing?
No, the diagnoses can make sense because sometimes a diagnosis will capture something that's syndromic. Like, oh, that diagnosis comes with these 5, 6, or 7 things, right? And there's a natural course to some diagnoses. You could say, well, it's really based in a biological process, and we can understand how to intervene in that biological process. So sometimes a diagnosis does tell us about what's going on and tell us about the natural course and how to address it. But that's not normally the case. And when we're just looking for symptom inventories and that's how we're making diagnoses, then you don't know how to understand the diagnosis, right? There's so many diagnoses where that diagnosis is made in a lot of different situations, many of which have nothing to do with the actual diagnosis. So then you can't trust it because we're not starting at the first principles. And as you said at the outset, as we do with our bodies, let's start with the first principles. What is going into them? Right? What are we doing with them? We don't start with those first principles. So then we lose the meaning often, even of concepts that can be meaningful, such as a diagnostic paradigm and how we understand that and what it means. But we lose it all in the symptom inventory. Okay, and now you have this number, like this is your diagnosis, it's a number, and you get this medicine for it. And very often there's no thought to who the person actually is, and like they don't know how to take care of themselves or even what's just been diagnosed.
Right. So when you talk about root causes for these things, since it's not, at least for the most part, I would think there might be some cases where this isn't the case, but since it's not a disease in the sense of a virus or a bacteria or something like that that's causing any of this, when we're talking about mental health conditions, if that's the right term, what are those root causes for the most part? Are they similar? Are they all the same? Are there sort of buckets of different root causes? What does that look like for people? If we're trying to dig into that and get to the cause, which I totally agree with you. I think any condition, even a physical condition, we should be looking at the cause, not the symptoms, to try to treat it. So what are those? How do we start getting to that somehow?
Well, there are models we can apply that are models of understanding, right? So we apply a certain model, then we can put other things into the machine, so to speak, of that model and come to understanding. So in this case, a biopsychosocial spiritual model has been a gold standard in mental health for a long time. It's a gold standard on paper. It's not what we actually do. And if we run through that, we can say the bio part is, what are the biological factors? There are mental health conditions that are highly based upon genetic determinants. So if 2 parents have actual bipolar disorder, it becomes highly likely that a child will, for example. But we have to know, what does that mean? What is bipolar disorder? That we have to make sure that it doesn't become a catch-all, right? A waste bucket for a bunch of other diagnoses. If we actually are looking for truth, right, then we will start with biological and we will say there are mental health conditions that have heritable elements, right? Or that have elements where the biology can be impacted, say, by early experience, and then that changes how the systems are functioning inside of us. Like, there's medical and biological aspects, And if we don't start there, right, then we're not starting at the beginning, right? So start out off at what does it say about us as a species? We have certain genetic determinants or impacts around our mental health. Let's think about that. Let's understand that. And there's knowledge that can come of that. Okay, once we're beyond that, we're in the psycho looks at the psychological parts of it. And here often we are looking at the person and the person's experiences. So if I felt confident about myself through some period of my life and then that changed, right? What happened in my life? That's a lot different than saying, oh, if these certain genes got passed down from the parents, there's a high likelihood of such and such a mental health condition. Let's survey for that, right? Once we get beyond that, we're looking at our experiences, how they have impacted us, how we navigate through the world, how we see ourselves in the world we choose to be in, who are the people around us, right? The choices that we make, just like choices of diet and exercise. You might have a person who has a certain genetic set of genes that might really push towards some physical health problems, right? Or might push towards, say, diabetes, even if the person is taking good care of themselves. Let's know about that, right? Mm-hmm. But then let's transition into how can you understand yourself and how to take care of yourself. And if you're not feeling in a good place, I say no one comes out of the womb thinking that they're less than, thinking that they can't make it, or that they can't be good enough for whatever's in front of them. So let's look at where that came from. Let's look at ourselves. What's going on in the unconscious mind, right? What do I think about in my conscious mind? What am I saying to myself? My self-narrative, my self-talk inside. Do I have a life narrative that lets me understand myself and makes me curious about branch points in my life and what those differences may have been, how I might have felt about myself after one twist or turn, that we begin to be curious about ourselves, interested in ourselves. And then we're able, in this biopsychosocial spiritual model, we can take the psychological, take how am I behaving in the world around me? Who am I choosing to have around me? Am I attending to my spiritual life? How important has that been to me? Would it be more important if I allow myself more latitude to be spiritual? It's like they become questions of self, but we have to start with a process that says, hey, there's a person here, and this person has mental health, so to speak, just like they have physical health. Right. Let's look at the basic determinants of that. And if we don't run through it that way, and we're just looking to check symptoms, that is not a search for knowledge. And it is a reason why it's unequivocal. Our mental health as a society has declined over time. And I think it's very predictably declined, even outside of some of the difficult societal events. So when you factor those events in, then we see, wow, our mental health has really plummeted in so many ways we can understand objectively.
And predictably why? What makes you say that? What are we doing, or what is happening that makes that obvious to you?
Well, if we're not being respectful of ourselves as human beings, right, in a way that we would start by thinking about the processes that go on inside of all of us. Like, we all have an unconscious mind, right? We all have self-dialogue inside of us, right? We all have life experiences that can change us in all sorts of ways and can change our understanding of ourselves and who and how we are in the world. Like, there are systems inside of our minds, right? And those systems are impacted by things that happen both inside of us and outside of us. If we don't start there, right, we're going to miss the thread. So we don't do healthy preventive things, right? We're not doing things even in early education to help people understand what's going on inside of them or around them. We're not educating. So how many people who are hurt by someone as a child, say, carry to adulthood that was their fault, right? They don't understand that if you're hurt by someone as a child, there's a reflex inside of us of confusion and fear and shame. And then the only thing we can do is determine that it was us because our brains haven't developed enough to have a different set of thoughts, right? But we don't educate children about that. We need an age-appropriate way. We don't run through the education system from early on through higher education, what really is true of us. It's like, if we didn't really understand that what we put in our mouths impacts how our bodies are, right? And then we're just trying to take a checklist later on of what might not be in the right place, but we don't we don't even link that to the basic determinants of health, like what you eat goes into your body, and there are fats and carbohydrates and proteins, and these things are important. And if we don't start there, how are we supposed to understand what's not right? Right. So then all we do is look at what's not right and we pathologize it. How many times do I see this person failed this medicine, failed psychotherapy, right? Then we say people failed in our healthcare systems, right? Because we've approached them in the wrong way.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I didn't even know that that was the terminology used. They failed in that.
Often gets used that way. Absolutely.
On the X is proudly presented by Mechanics Wear, the gloves trusted by pros. Originally designed by a legendary race mechanic, Mechanics Wear has become the top choice for anyone who needs tough, reliable protection. From construction sites to the front lines, these gloves offer unbeatable comfort, durability, and grip. Stay cool, dry, and in control with Mechanics Wear. Gear up for whatever comes your way. And just speaking personally, Mechanics gloves were the go-to glove for us in the military, certainly. And they're still my go-to glove when it comes to just working around the house. Glove that I've worn for decades at this point, and is still kind of my go-to glove. Mechanics Wear gloves are available at most retailers, as well as on mechanics.com and on GSA Advantage. Mechanics Wear is also proud to offer an exclusive 15% off discount through the ID.me program to military, veterans, and first responders. Click on the ID.me button in your shopping cart and follow the steps to verify your eligibility. First of all, when you talk about, you talked about kind of getting to those root causes, and is that something, so if we're trying to build that kind of an awareness, I would call it an awareness. I think you would probably call it sort of an agency. I've heard you use that term a lot. Is that something where does somebody need like the help of someone else from like a therapist standpoint? And how much of that can we just start to do on our own or learn to do on our own, the way we could learn how to do a certain exercise or to exercise safely? You brought up the thing about kids, and I completely agree with you. And I would extend it to so many training pipelines out there, whether it's the military or sports, kids sports, professional sports, you name it. We're
medicine,
so
right? We can put medicine in there too. Medical training.
Yeah. Well, that's for you would know that a lot better than me, but we're so good in most of those arenas of, yes, we need a physical fitness regimen. We need a physical fitness pipeline. We need to eat properly and all of that. But to your point, there's like zero on how to develop good mental health or mental training or whatever you want to call it, right? So how could we implement something like that? Like, what would that look like in your estimation?
We would just go back to the first principles, right? We would look at what are the determinants of our mental health, right? That some of what is likely or unlikely is genetically determined. Let's look at where we came from, right? And who we came from, and what is the history that may bring either biological determinants or psychological determinants. Trauma from 2 generations ago can change how genes are transcribed now, right? So if we start at the beginning, let's start at the beginning and look at ourselves, right? And look at the biological determinants and then the story of our lives. So what went on when born and raised, where, right? What were the major experiences? What was the narrative of self, where a person thought they could go or who they thought they could be, and who put those ideas into their head? We could say, do I think I can't get anywhere because, well, that's what people told me when I was growing up, right? What does that do to me? How does that change how my brain is functioning? We have to be curious about ourselves, right? Both as a species, this is how our brains work, right? If something bad has happened to you and you're running over and over again, I'm not going to be okay, or I'm not safe, or I'm not good enough, in your self-talk, why would we expect that you wouldn't be depressed or having panic attacks, right? And if we say, well, okay, you seem to meet criteria for depression, let's give you an antidepressant, we don't know where that's coming from. Maybe there's a family history where people in your family just get depressed out of the blue, it's genetically determined, and medicine really helped that. Maybe, right? But in most cases, there are other aspects of depression, for example, right? What are the thoughts going on in the person's head? How is the person's life going? Are they having experiences that show them they have agency, right? Or do they feel more and more disempowered? Is there a trauma that changed how the person felt? Right? We can't expect that we are going to understand ourselves unless we are curious and unless our systems are curious about us instead of taking symptom inventories and saying, well, here's your medicine or 10 sessions of a certain kind of therapy for whatever is going on in the person. Maybe that person needs 6 months of close attention and things can go very, very well for them. If we tell them it's just a little bit of therapy over a couple of weeks, they're not going to do well. Then the system says they failed, and then they feel like a failure and nothing is better. Right?
Yep.
This happens over and over as we have to go back to the first principles, which is a lot of what we've done around physical medicine that we have not done around mental health.
Mm-hmm. And what could that look like? Like, do you recommend certain practices, whether it's meditation, a specific type of meditation? I think what I'm trying to get to is there's a certain number of things, I think, to build these kind of habits, to make that realization of like, I'm saying this thing over and over and over to myself, and it's totally destructive and it's not helpful at all, where a lot of people feel like they are disempowered to do anything about that. Like they have no control over it whatsoever. It's just this like talk track in their head. I would completely disagree with that, where you can become aware of that and override that and develop new habits. In my estimation, it's basically a subconscious or an unconscious pattern that you've just developed by doing this, and you have to break that pattern. But are there specific, and tell me if you disagree on that, but is there a practice that helps with that people can just do on their own, whether it's meditation or something else? And is there a point where they do need to go talk to somebody about it, where it's like, what? Yeah, they're in a bad way, and this person should probably spend some time in a therapist's office, and where that line might be.
Yeah. And if a person is not feeling safe, thoughts of not wanting to be alive, thoughts of self-harm, these are signs of not being able to sleep and feeling desperation, right? Not enough energy or motivation in a person to even get out of bed and start the day. Like, these are red alerts, right? That say, hey, it's time to get some professional help, right? Because the person's in a position where they're either not safe or they're not in a position to figure themselves out, or both. So there are things that should signal to us, hey, I should worry about this. And those are basic ones. I mean, there are others too, but if we don't feel safety or any sense of agency, get help outside of us. But for most of us, we can start in a place that tries to bring some order to what's going on inside of our minds. Our thoughts tend to just jumble around inside of us. It doesn't mean we can't think our way through something, but when something is complicated and emotionally laden, it can just ping around inside of us. And then we tend to just kind of think the same thing over and over again. Like, I'm worried, I'm scared, or I don't know how to make my way professionally, or I don't like this job and I don't think I can't leave it, or then we just go over and over again, as opposed to doing something that brings order to the distress or the chaos inside of us. So for some people, that is meditation. They can clear their mind, right? And they can clear their mind of things that are intrusive and think in a way that they weren't able to, right, before they started meditating, right? Mm-hmm. Or we can write things down. When we put things into words, ideas that are in our head into words, then we're naturally bringing order. Now it has a time continuity to it. I'm going to write about myself from when I was young, and how did I feel, and what happened in my life, and what were the twists and turns. And now we start bringing order to it, and we can look at ourselves with compassionate curiosity. And we can do that if we write. We can do that if we talk to another person that's just a trusted person, that we can talk out what's going on inside of us. And again, it doesn't always solve everything, right? But it starts to bring some sense of understanding, or even the idea that there can be understanding. So many times people are suffering with mental health issues, and they are readily addressable. It's a combination of stigma, systems around us that are not helping systems. How many people go for mental health care and they come out feeling worse than when they went in? I see that happen. A lot of person went into an emergency department and they didn't feel help. They didn't even know that they saw anyone who asked about their mental health, and they spent 48 hours there in a small room, and then they left. There's a follow-up appointment eight weeks down the road. Like, this is happening all over the place. So a combination of stigma and this general zeitgeist, which is there's not really a lot to help us out there. And if you go and try and find help, you're likely not to find it under the insurance paradigms that we work in. I'm not saying people shouldn't go out and try and help themselves, but you're asking the question of like, why why are we in the place that we're in, right? And it's very hard to go get yourself help if you're ashamed of what's going on inside of you,
Yeah.
and if you feel that there's not help to be had, or if there is, you just don't know how to get it.
Yeah. The stigma is a big one, I think. I mean, I certainly have seen that with people, and I think with myself as well, just in terms of, I think, again, I go back to the kind of physical health thing. It's like, the sort of shame of I've got a mental health problem, or the shame of I'm 200 pounds overweight, can be very similar to one another.
Yes.
And people can definitely feel like people are judging them, or whatever you want to call that. But I also go back to me, there's so much agency, I think you would use that term, in that you're the one who can make a difference too, where it's regardless of either side of that, whether it's the sort of, hey, you've got anxiety or depression or whatever a condition like that, I guess, if you want to call it a condition, or you're out of shape, you have a lot of agency in determining your future with that and the way you want to change moving forward, right? You mentioned journaling. I don't actually know if you use that term, but writing things down.
Yes.
You think that's to me, or talking it out, to me, what's so good about those practices is you're taking chatter or whatever thoughts, so to speak, and you're objectifying it in a way. You're getting it out of you, whether it's talking through with a person or onto a piece of paper. And to me, that helps objectify it, where it's like, these are just words. This is just a stream of information that could be coming from a television or radio or my phone or an app or something like that. It happens to be coming out of my head, so to speak, but it's just information. I think is there a specific journaling practice? Because there's tons of them out there. That's you think is helpful for people?
I tend to be much less specific. I mean, I think oftentimes there's a very specific solution proposed to a lot of things, and then we get too far into the weeds, as opposed to saying, hey, it is helpful to put our thoughts into words in order to better assess and understand ourselves. How can you do that? Right? If that means you get up in the morning and you're going to write 20 minutes in that journal, you're going to do it before you go to bed, great, do it that way, right? If you want to take a couple hours and sit and tap out on the computer, like, what's going on in my life, right? Or what is it that's bothering me? So someone who would say, oh, I used to have relationships and I haven't dated anyone in 3 years, right? So the person might have more thoughts about that. It might write things down about that, like, well, what changed? What were things like before? And then that can lead to the realization of, oh, I've avoided potential partners for the last 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, right? So I changed the behavior. What led me to change? Then maybe there was a bad relationship, or a relationship that ended in a certain way, and that person felt very aggrieved or ashamed or whatever had happened, right? And then they change view of themselves and they change behaviors, but don't necessarily see that, because the thought could be, oh, no one wants me. I haven't even had a date in 3 years, right? That a person can feel that and say it over and over inside, right? But if they're putting order to it, they can see, oh, I mean, how different is that from saying, something happened 3 years ago that really hurt me in ways I still feel today. And when I look back at that, my behaviors since have been really different, right? And I think I'm afraid of being in another relationship. This is why nothing has happened these last 3 years. I have to look at that, like, what happened back then? How did it affect me? How is it changing my decisions? Now we're like, where the money's at, right? Like, X marks the spot. Dig there, right? That's where the money's at, as opposed to over and over again in the person's head, I'm not good enough, no one wants me. Then that becomes the story. And then the person may forget, for example, they had a robust dating life until that bad thing happened 3 years ago, and it's not even in their minds anymore. Yeah. Right. But this is how we work as human beings, that traumatic things that happen to us, including like negative things we may say over and over, conceptions of self we have, no matter how untrue they may be, can become our truth. Yeah. And so we have to be very careful in this compassionate curiosity about ourselves. I mean, it is the place to start. And again, as you're asking, it's about our individual selves, but also in the broader sense of ourselves as human beings. How do our minds work? Like, so many of us have been through significant trauma, and trauma creates a reflexive shame that can change behaviors and memories. So that sounds like a good place to start, But again, we're not starting with first principles either. How do we function as human beings? And how do I or you specifically function as a human being, and what's going on inside of it?
So you mentioned trauma there, and that's the subject of your book. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit. So to start, how do you define trauma? Because when I think of the word trauma, I think of kind of three ways, I guess, that I could think of it. One is sort of a traumatic event, so to speak, an incident, whether that's something that happened to me, like an assault or something like that, something I witnessed, like if I'm on ground zero, it's on September 11th and I witnessed the planes hitting the World Trade Center, or it could be something I've done too, or was part of,
Yes.
it could be something like that.
Yes.
So we kind of use trauma in that way. We use the word to sort of define like an acute injury, so to speak, like you break your arm, like that's a trauma to your body,
Yes.
kind of thing. And then we use the term to describe these sort of ongoing issues that people have, the ongoing psychological and emotional issue as a result, usually, of that event. Is that a good way to frame up that term? Do you think of it in the same way or a different way?
Well, a lot of it's similar, but I define trauma in a very hard science way. Now, often it's thought that trauma it's a soft concept. Anything that made someone not feel good now is a trauma. Maybe they're entitled to something. Like, this is not what I'm talking about with this science. The way that we have advanced neuroscience has come far enough for us to understand that trauma changes us. So real and true trauma changes our brains, and our brains are different as we go forward. So our coping mechanisms are overwhelmed, and then our brains are different. It's the opposite of a soft concept, right? It's something that rises to the level where we are different afterwards. And that can come from something acute, which, as you said, they're the ones that are most clear and obvious, right? That there's been a death or an injury, or there's been an event, right? Something witnessed. But we can also get those brain changes from chronic traumas. Someone who's chronically denigrated, right, over time, chronically seen as less than, could be based on anything: race, socioeconomic status, sexuality, gender. There's so many ways that people can be chronically denigrated, right, or seen as less than, right, by the world around us, and that can create the same brain change.
Okay.
Right? Just as vicarious trauma can create the same brain changes. So someone who's never been out of their hometown can inundate themselves with the tragedies that are going on, say, in the Ukraine, for example, and then can become so impacted by that, seeing death and destruction and fear, that person's brain changes. So, like, the science knows this. There are acute, chronic, and vicarious traumas that change our brains. It's a hard science concept.
Okay. How much of that, I'm just curious, how much of those brain changes do we have, I guess, responsibility for, or can we impact ourselves? And the way I'm thinking of this is, let's say it's a situation like that, somebody who's repeatedly bullied over and over and over again. And if you had two people, one person might react by starting to think less of themselves and taking that on board and
Yes.
being traumatized by it.
Yeah.
Another person might be like, I don't care what you say to me.
Right.
Do it over and over. It doesn't matter.
Right.
So how much of those changes that happen to someone's brain is just like nature, like it just happens? And how much is an agency of it's how I'm reacting to that? Like, I do have a choice in how I react. Even something like, take the most egregious assault or something like that. Even that, how much of it after the fact, okay, the incident is over, not happening anymore, is a result of now how I'm reacting, right? And
Right.
how much of that is a choice in that moment?
Right. Well, we often have a lot of control over that, but not always. Sometimes
Okay.
the chronic traumas, for example, might happen in childhood, right? And
Yes.
the child just doesn't know. And is it empowered? The brain, does it come along to know, hey, that's not right, and I'm not less than? The child just knows they're getting beaten up at school every day, right? And they don't know there's a broader world out there, and like, not everyone thinks this way, and these people are sick and unhealthy, and I'm not, right? But people, especially in childhood, don't have that ability, or the reflex can be so strong in us to trauma. So, it was recently 30 years since my youngest brother died by suicide. My response to that inside was feeling shame and guilt, right? An automatic response inside. Now, at some point when I saw, hey, like my thought processes are changing, my thought patterns are different. What I think about myself is different. Like I'm not handling life as well. I'm not taking care of myself like I was. Like I have to get help, right? But not everyone sees that, and we don't foster that in people. So the
Yes.
idea would be that we have helping mechanisms. Like no one told me. I never learned. I was a full-on adult. I hadn't gone to medical school yet, but I didn't know anything about this. That this tragedy has happened, and I'm trying to deal with the death of a family member, the impact on the family system. And by the way, it's like almost 100% predictable that there's a response in me that now I feel ashamed of myself in some way. I feel guilty. Why did this happen? And what does it say about me? And I'm dealing with all of that, the changes of self. So if we educated, guided both in true education and in how our medical systems, our healthcare systems handle this, then there would be outreach. And if you think, even if we only cared about dollars and cents, we would say there'd be so much less dysfunction, right? So many less presenteeism, people in the workforce, but not able to work. They're distracted by one thing or another. We would have outreach. We would think more about prevention and understanding, but we don't. So then we're relying on someone going and changing that. Like I remember at that time, it wasn't easy for me to go seek mental health care. I felt embarrassed about it. I felt there was something wrong with me that was going to be like made clear when I went to see someone, right? And I also I was fortunate. I had insurance, so I could make some phone calls and I could navigate my way in. Like our society doesn't make it easy, right? So I feel a lot of compassion for people who are in this place and they can help themselves, but they don't know that they can, right? And yes, part of what you're doing and I'm doing here is let's bring that message to people, right? But in a broader way, we could bring that message to people through education, through basic healthcare, just as we do with physical health.
Yeah. I think you use, I want to dig in on a concept there. I think you used the term, I think you said reflex, but I may be wrong on that. But I think of it as sort of reaction versus response in the way that, let's say somebody cuts me off in traffic and I have a reaction, like an angry reaction. And that reaction, in my estimation, is kind of a reflex. It's like, there's not a lot I can do there. Or like someone jumps out and scares me, that feeling I get that, oh, that's a reaction. I'm really not in control of that. But the response to that, so it's like if 2 hours from now I'm still angry, or 2 hours from now I'm still scared, that's now a response problem. That's okay, I'm not processing this correctly. I'm not there's no immediate thing going on here. Is that fair to say that? Is that kind of a fair estimation?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, because there are reflexes, right? In that sense, reactions, right? And those are things that are automatic. So technically, the word affect it refers to emotion kind of things, right? But they're created in us without our choice. So if someone comes out and scares you, right, then there's what's called aroused affect. Aroused means it's created in you that you feel angry or afraid, and it courses through you as a reflex or a response before you're even aware of it. Right? So these things happen to us. Absolutely, they're reflexes and responses to things. They course through us. But the question I think you're directing us towards is what happens next.
Yes.
Right. So if you're aware, someone cut me off in traffic, or someone scared me, or someone did something that really wasn't okay to me, and I feel afraid or angry or frustrated, right? Like it made that in me, right? And now, man, it's 2 hours later and I'm still feeling that. Then you can start thinking about yourself and what you might do differently, right? But what if you're not thinking that? Because the reflex or the reaction is so strong that you might think, oh, I'm an angry person, right? Or I'm a less capable person. I mean, the reflex or response of guilt and shame after the loss of my brother, I didn't see where that was coming from. It felt like it was real, and I should feel ashamed and I should feel less than. Why did I think that? Because that's how I felt, right? And without some help to direct my thoughts, is that really how you feel? Just like, how many people have I seen who've been assaulted by someone who no fault of their own. Someone came up behind them on the street and assaulted them. And that person then feels guilty and feels ashamed. I shouldn't have been there. I should have been wearing what I was wearing. I should have been looking around me. And they would never say that to someone else.
Right.
Never say that to someone else. Let's say someone else who was hit over the head, who was assaulted, they're coming in next. Tell them how it's their fault. Person would never do that. They wouldn't do that to anyone on earth except themselves. Why do we do that? Because we don't have the insight. If it's you, I can step outside of myself and I can see what's real and true and compassionate, right? If it's me, I'm often lost in that reflex, right? And then I feel the way that I feel, and I might feel that thing is my fault. I could feel that way forever because I don't get a chance to step outside of myself and look at that. Hence, talking with someone else, journaling, meditating, the kind of things that get us out of ourselves so we can see ourselves, so we can separate reaction from response.
Right. And does so much of that just go back to what you're talking about? Like, we're not properly trained for it. We don't have the tools already in place to deal with these things, to realize in that circumstance, like, I would call that storytelling. I'm just telling myself a story about this that isn't true necessarily.
Right.
I've just given it a spin, and now I'm telling that story over and over. Does that just come back to like, we just don't, we haven't taught anybody how to do these things in the first place?
Right. Yes. Right. We're not teaching ourselves how to live in the way that we live as modern people. Right? So much of these reflexes are in us through the development of human beings. Right? Probably a strong shame response to something that the group didn't like that stays with you in a very, very strong way and modifies behavior. Probably it made sense. We lived in small groups, and the tribe is trying to survive. And if someone does something that brings shame, eats all the food at night or something they're like, whoa, feel ashamed about that. It changes behavior and helps everyone survive. But that's not adaptive in the modern world, where there could have been a trauma, 30 years ago, and that person is still laboring under the guilt and shame of it, when it would be obvious to everyone else on earth and obvious to them if they weren't them, that there isn't a reason to feel that. But I'd see people, at one point I was doing therapy with people who are in nursing homes. And you would see, like, it really shocked me. It was early in my career to see this doesn't just go away, right? That person may be ruminating and feeling about themselves at 90 years old, the same way they did after that trauma changed how they felt, 75 years ago. And they don't know. Our brains don't go back and look at this. So yes, we don't know in the modern world how to understand how our brains and our minds work, how to look at and take stock of ourselves, and then how to make change. And I think it's quite sad. I think it's tragic that there's so much help to be had. Like, we know so much that can help us help ourselves, but the knowledge just isn't shared, so people don't know it. I kind of joke, I'm going to write a book that says everything I needed to know to live the way I want to live. I learned in 2 years of into training after medical school. Where, like, I was learning things as a second-year psychiatry resident that I think I absolutely should have learned in elementary school or in middle school, again, in an age-appropriate way. And I think there's real truth to that. We don't learn, whether it's in training programs for people who are going to have duress, like I said, military training programs, sports training programs. It's not even in programs like that, right? So certainly it's not pervading, our consciousness, in our education systems. Even think of bullies. When people are being bullied, people aren't taught around the person who's bullying you. There's a problem in that person, right? Who doesn't feel good enough, who's trying to feel good enough by bringing someone else down. Like, so we don't even do that. We don't educate around, like, what's going on in the bully, right? Is there a way of understanding this systemically where you can say, it's not me, that person has a problem, and that's why they're picking on me, right? So maybe we work against the reflexive guilt and shame. But most people who are bullied, especially at younger ages, come out feeling less than. It does not have to be that way, but we don't teach, we don't intervene, and we have a misguided, inventory checking system. It doesn't mean that diagnoses and medicines and therapy, it doesn't mean that none of these things are good and indicated and can be helpful, right? It just means that the systems are so off that we are not bringing to bear knowledge, capabilities that we have long had.
Every morning, we wake up knowing what's at stake. Freedom, honor, duty. This is more than a mission. It's the oath we took. It's the flag we wear on our sleeve and everything it stands for. We don't do it for money, glory, or fame, but for something deeper. It's for our families, for our freedom, for our way of life. And to anyone who tries to take that away from us, good fucking luck. Born Primitive Tactical, for those who defend.
There's a couple things that you talked about there that I want to get into. The first is just kind of going back to people experience trauma as children often. And to your point, they just don't know how to deal with it, right? They just like lack the ability at that age, whatever age it is, to process it correctly, whatever you want to call it. And then that sticks with them into adulthood and all of that. So when that happens, what is the best method for somebody to go back and kind of peel that away and sort out what's going on? If you experienced a trauma or ongoing trauma as a child where you just lacked the tools to deal with it, how do you go back and sort through that?
Well, as a start, it's so often helpful to look at ourselves outside of ourselves, right? To look at, like what happened to that child? What was the child's experiences, right?
Yeah.
To be able to observe, and then we can often see, that child who, for example, a child of an alcoholic parent who sometimes comes home with a good report card and gets a pat on the head, and sometimes comes home with a good report card and gets a slap, right? So you can say, well, you could look and say, well, that child was trying to figure out how to be good enough, right? And wasn't going to be able to, because the problem wasn't in the child. Right. The problem was in the parent who felt a certain way one day and a different way the next, and then responded differently to the child. So maybe that child grew up learning that they could never be good enough. They could never get anyone to like them and treat them in a way that was kind and consistent. And they can go back and look and say, yeah, I learned that. I learned that I wasn't good enough. Right. I learned that lesson. And at the time I learned it, it was the only lesson I could have learned. But now I can stand out and say it's not true that child wasn't good enough. It's that parent wasn't being responsible enough. So the child took away lessons that made sense at the time and maybe kept the child alive, right? Maybe the child needed to learn those lessons in order to get through that. But I'm not that child anymore, or you're not that child anymore, whoever it may be, or it's me or I'm talking with someone else. We can look at that and come to an understanding. And now we start to unravel the less than feeling inside, right? The feeling of what I learned about myself. And sometimes I learned that I don't have agency. I learned that I'm not good enough. We can go back and unlearn that by looking at where the lesson came from and what we really believe.
Yep. How much of that is a thinking problem and how much of it is a feeling problem, if we're going to separate those?
Sure.
I think of it as, again, some trauma you experience, especially as a child. And what you're talking about there, sort of thinking your way objectively through it. Okay, this is what happened, and this is why, and this is the story I've been telling myself, that aspect of it. But then there's kind of this other aspect potentially of suppressed emotions. And I didn't allow myself to express that. And like, I think of, the body keeps the score, kind of Bessel van der Kolk stuff, that kind of piece. How much of that is each side of that? And how do we process through the kind of the emotional component of it too? Because for a lot of people, I think, you have to be able to emotionally release this stuff as well. It's not just working yourself through the story, but it's like, hey, or PTSD is another example of this, certainly for a lot of veterans too. It's like, I lost a lot of friends in combat and never allowed myself to cry about any of it. Be sorrowful over that. Right. So how much of it is that, and how do we healthily work through that aspect of it as well?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. In the way that most matters, it's all about emotion. So if we look at logic, say our thoughts, we might equate that to logic, right? And our emotions, our feelings. Right? It's never the case that logic, thoughts, and emotions and feelings come together and emotions don't win. Our emotions and our feelings tell us the stories of our lives. So we're trying to use logic to patch through to the emotion changes. Right. So the person who's lost so many compatriots in combat and like hasn't been able to grieve or to feel anger about things, what's stopping that, right? And very often what is stopping that is a sense of shame that it happened, a sense of guilt that the person could have or should have done something different, right? Or maybe there are no thoughts to it. It's just that the reflex of feeling so badly about that keeps it all inside, right? And then what we're doing is we're trying to use words to get to the feeling. So instead of feeling guilty, responsible, angry, right, maybe in ways that are not productive, you say, okay,
Yep.
can the logic lead us to truth, right? So maybe the truth, for example, of a person and a group of people doing something very brave and very risky that they have been well trained for and they've hung together for, but knowing that there's real risk. And then when that risk happens, to being able to take pride in having done it and having been part of that group and recognizing there are randomness in life where sometimes people come through things and sometimes people don't. And like, it's not a person's responsibility, right? They give survivor guilt, that people feel guilty about coming through the other side of being able to reframe, like, what was I actually doing? Something brave and strong. And then what happened was something that was tragic or traumatic or incredibly unimaginably difficult. And like, I get to feel some compassion that I was there. I chose to be there, right? Out of goodness and bravery in me. And then something so difficult happened. Now we're shifting away from reflexive guilt and shame and all the things that can come of it towards, let's go look at that and what's the real story around that. And then we see often a real story of bravery and of the need for grief, right? And even of the mystery of life, that things we just don't know and can't understand, but we can get to those emotions because we have to get away from something first. Someone who's been through what you said and not gone back and looked at that, there's a reason, right? There's a reason they're not doing it. There's always something inside blocking that, or they would have gone back long ago. Mm-hmm. So we look at the self and the reflexes that happen, which are feelings, and then the feelings make stories, make logic. So now we want to bring logic right back and we want to assess again because we want to get back in there and we want to say, hey, maybe, again, I'm simplifying to some degree, but maybe like a feeling of guilt has absolutely no place here, right? And feelings of grief and mystery and even feelings of frustration, anger, whatever it may be, like maybe those feelings are more appropriate. You can't get to them unless you use words to take apart that kind of hermetically sealed prior story. This isn't really a story. It's just, I just feel bad. And because I feel so bad, it must be that I should feel bad. And then it just perpetuates.
Yeah. How much of that too do we have to, like, I know in my own kind of journey, I had to pick apart, like, I mean, I don't know if I want to call it PTSD, whatever you want to call it, right? But just sort of like mental health struggles post-service. Let's just kind of give it a very broad terminology there. I certainly had to work through the story aspect of it, of like this kind of story that for me, it was a specific incident, but just I was telling a very destructive story for a very, very long time. And I had to overcome that and start telling myself a different story. It took me like over a decade to do that.
Yes.
But then again, there was this other piece of, I didn't know this, but I had to emotionally release a lot of pent up energy in the form of mainly sorrow, just sort of crying and crying and crying and allowing myself to do that. The tools that helped me do this, and I'm not saying anyone has to do this, but in terms of finding some stuff that kind of got me there was I found, and I'm curious, I guess, on your take on some of these other methodologies that are out there that are popular right now.
Sure.
One was EMDR, which I found was really effective for me on the storytelling aspect of it. And then I did some psychedelics that helped with the emotional release. And that wasn't my intent going into it at all. It was just kind of what happened. On both sides of that, I have come to realize that neither was necessary, per se, to get those responses, but they were helpful in sort of triggering them.
Yes.
What's your cut on those things? Because certainly psychedelics is super trendy right now, and it's kind of all the rage in a lot of places. And there's other things like EMDR that can be adjacent to therapy or other pharmaceuticals or whatever. So I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts on those modalities out there for helping people.
I think those are both powerful modalities, and powerful modalities can be very helpful again in the right hands, treated with respect in the right set and setting. So yes, I like how you said it's not that you needed those tools. There are other tools maybe that could have gotten in there, but those are the tools that got you in there, right? So the idea is ultimately in the world around us, there's a pretty big tool chest. Right now, we could take a tool out of that chest and misuse it and harm ourselves more, right? But if we're looking at the tool chest and saying, well, there's a lot of ways in here I could help myself, because I know, and you're saying you needed to feel emotion, release emotion, change emotion. I understand, but we don't do that without a structure around it, right? So we don't do that without, for example, EMDR can decrease the automatic negative emotions, right? And then it just gives you more room and space to bring yourself to truth, right, inside. So it's just one way of looking at a powerful tool. But what we're trying to do is change the story. Like when you say it took a decade to get there, I think, I mean, a way that makes, it's a lot of times I hear things that make me feel sad. Like it shouldn't have had to take a decade. Like in a world that was really looking and saying, hey, in some ways, probably this destructive story you were telling yourself was natural and probably even expected after what happened, but it doesn't mean that it's real and true and right.
For sure. And I think what was so interesting to me about that experience was I didn't do the EMDR until like a decade later. And it just kind of opened my eyes to that. And what it made me realize was kind of, holy shit, like I've just been, it just helped me tell a different story. And it came back to me for like, man, I could have done that a long time ago. To your point, I could have just told a different story. Like I didn't need to do this.
Right. And here's the key. And I know you're saying this, but I want to really emphasize it. It's not just a different story. It's the true story, right? Or it's the right story, right? It's because a lot of times what people will think or worry about is if they do these things, they're going to change to a different story, but the story won't be true. It's just a story that makes them feel better, right? But that's not what we're looking. That is absolutely not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about the changing to a different story is a story that's real and true. It's the story that you would tell if somehow you could see what happened, but you weren't you and you were observing, right? Then you would tell a different story. It would be a true story. And then the emotions now are congruent with the story. So maybe there's stories of sadness and loss. Their emotion maybe of sadness and loss, whereas the emotions were different before. And the emotions weren't really the congruent ones. Like, I felt ashamed because I lost my brother to suicide. Like, that's not a story we're going to look from the outside and say that makes sense. It's just a reflex, right? So when I could get to feeling grief about it, sadness, that's different. It's real and true. So the key that you could have told yourself a different story, yes, which tells me the real story is in there, right? And someone else who may be in that position, whatever the story is, doesn't have to wait 10 years. Right. I got to look at what's inside of myself and what's real and true. And then I stave off unhappiness and also the weight of, difficult things over the intervening time.
Yeah. I think of it as, I mean, I still remember all of this stuff. So the sort of the facts, so to speak, haven't changed at all. It just doesn't bother me anymore. And I started to think of it in the context of like a sporting event, like the Super Bowl, right?
Yeah.
And there's two teams and there's fans of both teams. And whatever happens in that game, one team wins, one team loses. Right. And the facts of what happened, what transpired in the game are identical on both sides. But one group of fans says, oh man, that sucks. We lost. And the other group says, yes, awesome. We won. Yes. And that's just an interpretation of the facts. Right. And that's the way I started to look at it. It's like, I can root for either team. In this context, and it doesn't change what happened at all. It's just the interpretation I'm creating.
Yeah, and I think, tell me if I'm getting this right, I think the changing of the interpretation to truth changes the emotions about it, right? So it's like our memories don't have meaning in and of themselves. They come alive and have meaning based upon the emotion that's attached to them, right? So one might think, hey, there's an emotion flag attached to those memories in you, right? The memories haven't changed, right? Correct. But what's changed is the flag that's attached to them, and the flag that we're coming up with. Oh, these memories come up with the flag says, what emotions do we go and get? And they were, if I'm understanding correctly, they were negative emotions. And then as your understanding of it shifts, right, to the story that's the real and true story that's respectful of what you went through, right? That story then has a different emotion flag attached to it, and it says you don't have to go get those negative emotions. Go get the ones that are appropriate to the story, right? And then you don't feel tormented by that memory. And I think it's crucial what you're saying. It's not that you forgot the memory. It's not that the facts change. Everything is the same, but the flag of emotion on it now is like the appropriate one, the justified one, the real one that makes sense for the circumstances, not one that more likely, if I'm understanding correctly, was born of a reflex or a reaction to it.
Yeah, it was just a realization of this is a choice. I have a choice in how I want to talk about this internally to myself. And the thing that it was the prompt of EMDR that I think made me realize that. It was, for anyone who's never experienced this, you're kind of holding these paddles and there's these tones and you're recounting sort of whatever this traumatic memory is. And it was like, here's what happened, here's what happened. And then the prompt was, well, what do you want to tell yourself about that? Or what do you want to feel about that? And to me, that idea of, I never thought of it that way. Like, what do I want to feel about this? What would make this? And it's like, I can make that decision and feel that way about it. Tell that story instead. Was just such a light bulb moment for me.
Yes. And I know you're saying this, I was going to emphasize again, because what you're shifting to is true. It's not as if that works. If, like, let's say I go out and I harm somebody and I feel bad about it because, like, I know I did the wrong thing and I purposely harmed someone. You know, I could try and tell myself a different story, right? But it's not real. It's not true. Like, I should feel badly about it as I do at the outset. The difference here is you can let go of those, the emotions that the memory goes and gets, because you're using your whole self, right, to make a choice. Like you said, I can feel one way or another, but what you're bringing to bear, I think, is, well, what's right? Right? Like, what actually fits in those circumstances? What if it weren't me? What would I say to a person? Like, what's the real, true, healthy way to feel about this? Then you're able to shift and you're more congruent with self because you're in accord with reality. We're not trying to shift you from something that feels bad just so you don't feel as bad. We're trying to shift you from something that feels bad to truth so that you feel better.
Yeah. Good point. Yeah, for sure. I know we're running up on time here. So let's just go back a little bit to how we get ahead of this. I think is kind of maybe a nice way to finish things up. When you think about kids or young people and getting some of these, training, whatever you want to call it, into school or into young person development, how can we start potentially doing that? What could that look like in your mind? If we're, get ahead of this stuff, what does that look like?
I think the first step, I think, is for us as adults, just understand better, right? And again, why would we not? I mean, if let's say we understood our mental health extremely well, and boy, we've got all this stuff down, what's going on inside of us, but we have like no idea that what we put into our mouths and whether we move our bodies matters, right? We say, look, let's get some basic principles of that entrenched in ourselves, right? And if it's entrenched in me, now I've learned something that's important, then I can behave differently and I can pass that along. So, I have two young children and I try and think about, like, what lessons are they getting from the world around them? What lessons are they getting from me? Hey, I want to talk to them in accord with these things that I know, right? Mm-hmm. So if someone says something and my daughter feels really badly, like, well, why did she feel badly, right? She knew it wasn't true, but it felt bad that someone said that to her. Like, right, those reflexes are inside of us, right? And we want to know what's true, even if someone is telling us something different. And we want to be conscious of that when we're talking to other people. So, there are ways that by understanding, we help ourselves and we help the children, anyone. It doesn't have to be children, the people around us. I mean, there's a good first step. If we didn't know anything about diet and we just threw anything into our mouths, I mean, our mental health understanding isn't that much better. Then, like, hey, let's start with some basic premise of, like, here's a bunch of things that are really unhealthy. Here's a bunch of things that are pretty healthy. We're just starting with the basics, but now I know that I can take better care of myself. And if I see that person who thinks, you should eat 20 brownies a day, and that's why wouldn't you? Then I could say, hey, you know what? I mean, actually, it may kind of matter, right? What you're putting in your mouth. And it seems maybe it's kind of ridiculous to talk about it that way, but but we're that primitive in so many ways in our understanding of mental health. So let's learn some basics for ourselves and for the people around us. I mean, that's a hell of a start if we can do that.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any other, I think that actually the last thing I want to hit on here is I've heard you talk about this, and kind of the pinnacle of this is agency and gratitude is kind of the things we're driving for, so to speak. And so can you just quickly summarize what you're talking about there and what that can mean for people in terms of their mental health? Yeah.
Well, another way to look at agency is empowerment, right? And I think in 25 years of doing this, empowerment, agency, it comes along with gratitude. The sense that I'm responsible for the choices that I make in my life, and I have to take that responsibility, right? Also, I'm grateful that I'm here to make those choices, that I have a brain and a body that allows me that latitude. I can be in this world around me, that I can share a smile or a kind word with someone else. Agency and gratitude come together, and they're active words, right? Then we start taking greater control of our lives. And in that example of the person who says, "Oh, no one wants me, I haven't had a date in 3 years," who then looks away, wait, why is this? My gosh, something terrible happened 3 years ago or something. I got to work through that and maybe make different choices. Now that person feels a sense of agency. It's not that no one wants me, it's that something difficult happened and I have to maybe work through that. And then I don't have to be afraid of any potential relationship partner. I feel empowered. I feel the agency to not live in that lie that no one wants me and I just go on that way, right? But to say something changed how I'm behaving and I want to honor that, but I do want to make different choices. And I'm grateful that I'm here to make them and that someone might like me in the first place. Let me respond in a way that lets me take that chance, right, of meeting someone new. Now the agency and gratitude empower different choice, right? But we have to understand ourselves, and we don't get to that point, right, if we're still living in this story that somehow magically 3 years ago, I started being completely unattractive to everyone else on the planet. That's not going to make me change my behavior. If I go and look and see, hey, I was good enough for relationships before, and some of them went pretty well, and then this thing happened, this thing has changed me, my thoughts, my feelings, my behaviors. I want to understand that because I don't want to be changed in that way. Right? I want to make different choices. Now we become empowered, and the agency and gratitude come to the fore. But it has to start with this compassionate curiosity, with a different understanding. The way that you feel better now and what you described is because you went and looked at that, right? You did something about it that allowed for the possibility of change in you. And it's this that we have to do in order to discover there's agency and gratitude in all of us, to some degree, and most of us have a lot of it in us. It just may be that we're not in touch with it because we're telling ourselves these stories that come of difficult or traumatic life experiences. And it's actually us who are sort of disabling ourselves then, right? And we can stop and look at that and say, I don't want the stories that I'm telling myself to hamper or hinder me if those stories aren't true. If they are true, let me think about it. What other change do I make? But if I go look at most of those stories, most of the things that are oppressing us, and we really search for understanding, then we do find a different path. That's why what I do for a living, I find to be most of the time, very joyous and optimistic. Sometimes people will think, oh, it must be so depressing because no one ever gets better. Who said no one ever gets better? Really, right. It's a reflection on how negative we feel about the systems around us and, the stigma and the helplessness. I think the message I'm delivering is a very uplifting one. There are many, many ways we can help ourselves. We're just not in touch with them, but the knowledge is there, just as if we understood nothing about diet on a day-to-day basis. But we understand everything we do about physiology. Let's use that knowledge and translate it into something that helps me be happier and healthier today and tomorrow.
Yeah, 100%. Well, that's great. Let's end it there. You're on time. We're up on time for you anyways, but I love that. I love the empowering message. I'm totally in agreement with you on that I just think it's so important. So, and we didn't get specifically into your book, but everyone out there, his book Trauma, it's great. I'm about 3/4 of the way through it. I was trying to cram to get it in before the interview, but we touched on a lot of topics that's in there anyways, but really appreciate the time. Thanks for coming on the show.
You're very, very welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to On the X, an Ironclad original series presented by Mechanics Wear and the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation. For more information about the work of the foundation and to learn how you can get involved, please visit NavySealFoundation.org. See you next time.
We don't just do the filmmaking. We do everything. We've taken a case study of over 30 projects that we've done over the past 15 years, and we put together what we believe is the most effective and efficient content funnel for brands. They need content on a daily basis. They need to be talking to authentic end users. We want your team to bring its most challenging problems and allow us and our team to apply our proven methods to your brand to take it to another level.